Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today we're going to continue our series on the poetic genius of, and we're going to be looking specifically at the poetic genius of Nerissa Ravencroft. So if you haven't seen my previous videos on In My Feelings and Sweetest Scarlet, I recommend checking those out, but you don't have to have seen them to understand what we're going to discuss in this one. And if you like this type of content and want to be notified when the next episode is released, please consider subscribing to the channel. So, a little bit about the song and the video. As you guys know, I like to go into these blind, so there's not going to be too much here. But Blue World was released on March 28th, 2026, and it's a collaboration between Nerissa Ravencroft and Soji Meguro, who you might know from Persona 5. Nerissa, however, wrote the lyrics by herself, so her work will be the main focus of this video since we're really going to be focusing on the lyrics rather than the composition. Also, this is a sad song, so if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, just be aware that our discussion will be delving into some of these themes. Also, as I mentioned before, I usually go into these videos blind, but I do know two fun facts about this song. One, it's deeply personal to Nerissa, so as always, I'm going to be treating it with the respect it deserves. And two, the formatting of the lyrics as posted on sites like Genius is technically incorrect, so we're going to delve into that more later. Also, I always like to start these off with a general disclaimer, so with all of these episodes of The Poetic Genius of, I want to remind everyone that these are my personal interpretations and observations. I by no means am intending to project these ideas onto the artists. I don't fully know their intent, so it's not my place to say. That being said, the death of the author is a concept which basically states that once a piece of writing is published, it is no longer the sole property of the writer, especially in regards to interpretation, and therefore interpretations can be made without necessarily needing to follow the author's intent, though it can always be helpful to consider author's intent. For example, we'll be looking at this with the line spacing of the lyrics. But with that being said, I think we can jump right into our interpretation and have some fun with it. So let's jump over to the chalkboard. It's kind of fun. It's been a while since I've made one of these, so this is actually like deeply nostalgic. But if I remember correctly, the format of this is we're going to read through the first verse and then we'll get into the actual analysis. So the first verse goes, "Walking an empty road, nowhere for me to go. Lost and lonely, yeah, it's only me. Burnt out like candlelight, left blazing through the night, melting slowly until nothing else is left of me." So the thing I mentioned earlier about the line formatting is I listened to a bit of Nerissa's video, I believe it's called The Melancholy of Nerissa Ravencroft, and it explains that when she publishes her lyrics, they get published like this, where it's the full line, but actually where these commas are is where it should actually be creating a new line. The tough part is I don't know fully where that is because there isn't always a comma. So I don't know, for example, if this last line should be split down the middle somewhere. So I'm going to leave it as it is published, since also if this was like a book of poetry, that's what would go to the printing presses. But that being said, I'm going to keep that in mind when I'm discussing things like rhyme scheme. So, we have me and me, but we also have this lonely, because again, if there was a line break there, we have candlelight and night. So as they're currently published, it's almost like internal rhyme, but it can also be said to be, rhymes at the end of the line. It's interesting too because it sort of still alternates in that there is this go, but I'm not seeing another line elsewhere that would rhyme with that. And then in general, we also just have some other internal rhymes that, you wouldn't count if you were counting it as like an A-B rhyme scheme. But, melting and nothing, that locks in, and blazing, those have those sounds. And those sounds are sort of similar-ish in being soft to like the me's and lonely. They don't rhyme, but they're, and also we have walking. So we have, a lot of verbs right from the get-go, and those ing verbs are creating similar sounds. Now, let's get into the actual language of what's being said and try to figure out some things like theme, sort of the message, and we can look at things like tone. I mean, the tone right away is one that's very somber and sad. We already get a ton of empty, nowhere, lost, lonely, burnt out, melting, nothing left of me. These are very, somber, sad phrases, verbs, adjectives, etc. That we're having that are working together to create this more somber and sad tone. But in terms of the actual meanings, we have walking an empty road, nowhere for me to go. This is already extremely interesting because we have this active verb of walking, so it's implied that Nerissa is choosing to continue walking. It's probably not her choice to be walking down an empty road, but she is walking. She's continuing to move rather than being on an empty road and then choosing to just stay in one place and somewhat wallow in that. I think by having that active verb be the first, word, it's telling us that there is still a sense of searching. Because, if you were to think about walking down an empty road, especially if you have nowhere to go, that implies that you don't have any objective where you're not like, oh, well, I'm just walking down this road to get to Chicago, and even though it's empty, I'm still just trying to get to Chicago. The emptiness then would almost be a blessing because you would get to Chicago faster. But here, since there's nowhere for me to go, there isn't that clear objective, which tells us, though, that there's still a sense of searching, because if you're not trying to get to Chicago, why are you walking on a road? You know what I mean? Obviously not Chicago, but yeah, there's that sense of we're walking for some reason. We may not know why, but by walking, we're trying to search what may be further down the road. Maybe it's not always empty. Maybe there's others. Maybe there's something else that we're searching for. It could be meaning, could be anything, really. We don't know yet. And then nowhere for me to go is also interesting because it's implying that it's for me to go. Otherwise, it would just be nowhere to go. Because if there's nowhere to go, then, that could mean a million different things. It could either be, as simple as you're bored and you have nothing to do, so there's nowhere to go. Oh, there's nowhere to go, nothing to do. But within the context of the song, there's also that sense of, if you have nowhere to go, maybe because it's this empty road, it's sort of a desolate sort of description. It could be that they're just genuinely within this mental space or within this physical space, there's genuinely nowhere to go. But nowhere for me to go implies that there may be places for others to go. Maybe it feels like everyone else who's walked this road before, since we know it's empty now, or maybe they're on different roads because, we have multiple different roads and highways. So, there isn't one singular road. Everyone's on their own path. So other people may have somewhere to go, people to see, things like that. But specifically for Nerissa, for me, there's nowhere to go. So there's this clear sense of loneliness, but also an aimlessness, but also still a sense of searching. Now, the next line, lost and lonely, yeah, it's only me. It's a bit more straightforward, but I do want to acknowledge that these two L sounds, or I guess actually three, because lonely and only, there's a lot of nice musicality going on here with the word choice, but it's pretty straightforward. It's just also letting us know that, again, she's lost, but she's walking down this road, so again she's searching for something and she's lost. And lonely, lets us know again that this isn't a loneliness she wants, because sometimes people could be trying to write something else about how they're so overwhelmed by sort of the noise and buzz of the city or something like that, and they actually want some time alone. But here, since we know that our main subject is lonely, we know that this is not a desirable situation to be in. Now, this next part is especially interesting. So, burnt out like candlelight left blazing through the night. This tells us a lot because we know that part of this loneliness and emptiness and feeling like there's nowhere to go may be a direct, result of burnout. And, that's something we've still actually like a very recent, when you look at the larger scheme of life, kind of concept that we're discovering. And so art is sort of still reacting to this sense of burnout. I mean, it's really only in this internet era and high-tech era that it's way harder to sort of get a break, get a moment to yourself, and also just sort of like unwind and detox. And so burnout is becoming much more prevalent and something that actually causes a lot of loneliness, because if you're too burned out from work and from working on creative things, then you're going to feel less motivated, or like you have less time to actually hang out with other friends. And then that can actually cause you to accidentally neglect relationships, which can only further make you feel more and more alone. However, what's also really interesting about this is there's sort of like a utility to candlelight and candles. People use candles for light. And so, for example, if I'm grading a bunch of my students' English papers, and I'm using candlelight to help me see the papers, I'm not the candle, I'm using the candle. And when the candle burns out and there's no more candle left, it doesn't impact me in the same way that it's impacting the candle. And so here, Nerissa is using this metaphor. Well, actually, since we have like candlelight, we're actually getting it as a simile, because a simile and a metaphor are similar. Simile is when you use like or as, and metaphor is when you basically don't use like or as. But so the simile is comparing Nerissa to a candle that's been left blazing through the night. But we have to wonder, to a degree, what is or who is using her in this way that's leaving her feeling so exhausted. Because you certainly can use yourself as a candle in this sort of way. And that's when people, when they are burned out, they'll often use the phrase where they were, burning a candle at both ends. And that sort of means that, if you have a wick of a candle on both ends, you're going to burn it out twice as fast, but you're trying to use it twice as more, but you're actually just using up your resources twice as fast. But I think that's something we should keep in mind as we continue reading through this, because what's interesting is that this whole opening of feeling lost and lonely and feeling like there's nowhere for Nerissa to go, for me to go, it implies the existence of others. Other writers might try to describe their own loneliness, and they intentionally make it feel as if they're like on Mars, where there's no other humans there, they're all alone, there's a true isolation there. But there's a different type of isolation when you almost see the echoes and ghosts of others. Maybe there's other colleagues who are burning them out. Maybe there's people who have abandoned them and left them on this road. The road should be busy, but it's empty. It's notable that it's empty, and, otherwise we wouldn't even need that adjective. You don't have to describe the road as empty if you should believe it already to be empty. You only have to describe it if it's different than how it should be. And then melting slowly until nothing else is left of me. Here we're getting a continuation of this candle image, which is technically the third line that this candle image is going on, since again, there's these line divisions. But again, that's sort of reflecting what I was saying earlier about how I'm not impacted by using the candle, but the candle is. The candle is getting burned until there's nothing left of them. And I think that's a really good image for burnout, because also you get sort of the wordplay of, you burn a candle and being burned out. But this language really reflects that there's like a very real consequence to burnout. I think a lot of people think that sometimes burnout, it's like, well, just take a day break, take a nap, get a little bit of sleep, and then you should be fine. But you can't take a burned out candle and then, tell it to take a day off and then come back and expect a full candle again. That's just not how it works. All right, and then we have our chorus, which goes, colored in shades of gray, watching the days pass in front of me, longing to find a way I can fly away. I'm drifting through this blue, blue world. All right, and some of my poetry students out there may be sitting up in their chairs and thinking of, the terrible adage of, oh, the curtains are just blue. I think this song is a great example of proving that the curtains are not just blue and that one can use color to describe a state of emotion. I've talked about this before. I've always hated that sort of, oh no, the curtains are just blue. The author had no further intent than that. Because again, death of the author. Even if the author says the curtains were just blue, we're still allowed to, interpret them more deeply than that. So, taking a look at this, I think what's interesting is I've seen some people getting what I believe to be confused about some of the language in the beginning because you have a blue world, but then you have shades of gray. However, if you look at the actual grammar of it and the way that the sentence structure is, you can see that it's not actually a contradiction. So, colored in shades of gray, watching the days pass in front of me. So, the subject of this is me and I. So, it's not the world. Here Nerissa is the one watching the days pass in front of her. It's not the world that's watching the days pass in front of her. So who, therefore, while they are watching the days pass in front of them, who is colored in shades of gray? It's Nerissa who's covered in shades of gray, not the blue world. Part of why that matters is because it gives a further depth to the loneliness of Nerissa. Imagine living in a world where everything is blue and melancholy and lonely and empty and desolate and just sort of abandoned, and there's this real somberness which we're getting with blue. And then you still don't even fit in within that. You're almost a further level of sadness, because if we associate blue with sadness and sort of, melancholy and stuff like that, gray is most certainly associated with feelings like depression and sadness, and it's a total removal of color, which is, in terms of poetry, we interpret that to be like the lowest of emotional lows is if you can't even see the color in the world, you can't even see the sad blue. So I think that that's like actually an extremely heartbreaking sentiment to be still removed from the world, even in your own type of sadness. And then just a sense of watching the days pass in front of me. This is a sentiment that I personally can resonate with. I think we kind of all can to a degree, some people certainly more than others, but especially with, the last decade we've all been alive, I think a lot of people have been expressing a sentiment of feeling like time is going by eerily fast and, always being told that there's so much you're supposed to do with your time and feeling like you either can't fit it all in or that you're missing the opportunities or you're behind. And the more you feel those thoughts, the more you are conscious of just how fast time is flying away in front of you. And and that's where you get this longing. There's a longing to find a way where, Nerissa can fly away from the blue world, but unfortunately she's drifting through it. And right now she doesn't have a way. And it's hard because she's longing to find a way, which almost implies that she's not yet searching fully. It's like she wants to begin looking for a way. She wants to begin trying to find a way, but for whatever reason, whether that be just that it's too emotionally taxing and exhausting, she's not yet at a state in the song to begin that search. And I think it's just interesting too, this sort of using colored as this sort of like almost active adjective, because Nerissa is colored in shades of gray, but who is doing the coloring? And similarly, who is making the world blue? Is it, and by who, it doesn't have to be a person. Who can be, personification of something like depression or just loneliness, as we've been seeing all these themes of longing, is almost like doubly being used, because longing to find a way to fly away, but also just longing is just a sort of sentiment. And watching, there's a passiveness to this, but it's like an unwilling passiveness. If you're watching the days pass in front of you, you're not actively participating in them, and there's sort of almost a disconnect where you are just the observer watching the days pass, rather than even recognizing those days as your own. It's almost like an out-of-body experience where you're watching your life pass before you, and if you're the one watching it, it's almost like you're watching yourself, which separates you from yourself. And similarly, I think there's sort of an interesting passiveness to the colored in shades of gray. Nerissa isn't saying, I am colored in shades of gray, or you colored me in shades of gray, or loneliness colored me in shades of gray. Very intentionally, she removed and omitted having a subject at the start of this, and that's why it's not until you get to this next line, technically the third line, that you would then realize that it's not the world she's describing in this blue world, it's her that's colored in shades of gray. So it also shows this sort of further removal where at times we think she's talking about the world and then we realize she's talking about herself, and other times we may think she's talking about herself but she's talking about the world. And so those two things are very separate. They aren't connected, and there is this disconnect in that. And again, drifting, it's a very passive. It's not swimming through a blue world. It's not actively trying to float through a blue world. Drifting is very much like you are not controlling how you are moving. Whether you want to or not is also an interesting question. If you're unconscious and floating on a river, then you are also drifting through the river. But also, if you just choose not to swim and let the river move you, you're also drifting through a river. And I think that's something important to keep in mind with this. And here we have the next verse, which goes, "It's always been clear to me how cruel the world can be. My shadow's the only one beside me. No love to call my own, no notifs on my phone. Sunken silence has engulfed the very life I lead." And to, talk about the rhyme scheme here, again, there should actually be some splits here. So it should be, me and be, only, and then me, and then own and phone, and then sunken silence has engulfed the very life I lead. There's almost a visual rhyme here, but not a clear rhyme. But that gives us me, be, only, me, and then own and phone, which gives us an A, B, B, and then I'd say technically a C, D, or just a C rhyme scheme, depending on if this last line is supposed to be divided or not, which, again, I'm not sure fully of the total formatting. I'm sort of guesstimating some of these above ones based on rhyme scheme, but again, it's also could be seen as being just be and me, and then phone and lead, which is different. So in terms of the actual meaning here and going line by line, it's always been clear to me how cruel the world can be. I think what's also interesting is clear to me obviously is sort of a discussion of, understanding. If something's clear to you, it's easy to understand, it's easy to see. But also, with all of this description of, being colored in shades of gray and it also being a blue world, it almost feels like the world wasn't always blue and it was sort of painted blue, and that could be, a reflection of Nerissa's inner. And again, I'm uncomfortable saying Nerissa because I sort of mean the character Nerissa. I don't want to put this on, Nerissa, the lyricist, that it's true to her, because obviously I don't understand any of her psychology, I don't know her, etc. So I'm only using Nerissa as sort of a placeholder for the me character, when the line says me, but it could just be a totally different protagonist that Nerissa chose to channel for this. But anyway, it could be that the Nerissa of the song, because of this loneliness, is sort of projecting a blue onto the world, and therefore it's implied that you almost have the world underneath this blue, but it's been painted blue, which means that if it's painted blue, it's covered in blue, which means you can't see it well. Similarly, if Nerissa here is then, suddenly, colored in shades of gray, it's harder to actually see, the real Nerissa underneath that gray. So, despite that, we have this, this ability to see clear how cruel the world can be. And what's interesting is it's not how cruel people in the world can be necessarily, it's how cruel the world can be. And I think that can go both ways. It can mean the world is in the people in it, can be referred to as the world, or sometimes the world can be treated almost more like it's this sort of third party, it's the environment, but it's also sort of like the setting, just like how we discuss how people being put in different environments, like if they're on a deserted island and there's only two people and they have to work together to survive, there's a different level of tension and stress and power dynamics and all sorts of stuff to that relationship because of the environment they're in. Or people who are put in jails and prison may have to act a different way and feel different just purely because of the environment that they're in. And similarly, the world within this could just be the environment that's making people act a certain way, which is then, leaning towards cruelty. Then we get my shadows, the only one beside me. And I feel like this is sort of an interesting, I feel like there's a couple different ways you could take this. This is sort of a Green Day reference, you could say, with Boulevard of Broken Dreams. I believe Nerissa's sort of personification of her sort of best friend character that's not like, because like she has like her fans who are bird creatures, but I believe there's another like non-fan character that's a shadow, that's named Shadow. So this could be a reference to that. Shadow's the only one Nerissa has. Or it could just be, then the other way to just take it is just as it's saying is that the only thing Nerissa has on her side is her shadow. And I think this is also really interesting if you try to, get more into it, because if you have someone who's so lonely that they're starting to discuss their shadow as being, beside them, one, that's already implying a level of loneliness and isolation that you almost have to personify your shadow to see it as being another being. However, your shadow is also sometimes treated literarily as a reflection of yourself. It could be a reflection of your consciousness and sort of the inner workings of your mind. So it could just be that Nerissa is almost saying that, her own mental state, and honestly, shadow is usually treated in this sort of Freudian way of like almost being the darker part of someone's inner mind, and that could be their kind of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing. But I think it can also be, for example, that sort of depression. So in a way, at first it can sound kind of nice where it's like, oh, well, my shadow's the only one beside me. So therefore, at least I have my shadow, and my shadow I can sort of personify as being like another being here. But you could also say that if the shadow is sort of this gloomy shadow of depression and loneliness that's sort of, and burnout that's sort of lurking and following Nerissa, because that's sort of the other joke is that like you can't outrun your shadow, it's always connected to you. That if you read this as like basically being my loneliness is the only one beside me, and sort of my like emotional hurt and pain is the only one beside me, and I can't escape it, it becomes a much darker, sadder expression than being sort of a just saying like, all I have is my shadow. And I also think in a third way, it sort of reflects almost a disconnect from oneself. Because if your shadow is your mirror self and you're seeing it as another being that's beside you, you're not seeing it as yourself, you're seeing it as something else that's beside you. So it shows sort of a disconnect from self, which is ultimately a even more drastic version of loneliness. I mean, if you're already lonely and then you don't have yourself anymore, just how lonely are you? And then we get into our next two lines. And I want to focus at first on just this third line. And again, I know it can actually be like the fourth or whatever, but no love to call my own, no notifs on my phone. So first, we're getting just sort of a declaration that Nerissa / this character of Nerissa is currently single and doesn't have a love to call their own. So again, as they're walking down this empty road, and they have nowhere to go, they also have no love basically looking for them or who could kind of help pull them out of this blue world. But then we get no notifs on my phone, which I think is a really interesting line because at first, I mean, you don't see a lot of references to technology in, poetry. But again, this isn't, published as a poem, it's published as a song. But I think it's especially poignant here because I feel like something that a lot of people are sort of waking up to is that there's sort of this extra level of loneliness that we have in this age of technology that we're in, because at first technology felt like it improved communication and you were able to contact your friends so much more easily than before. And you were also able to have like things like social media, so you could follow them even if you're not having a conversation with them. You could see what they're up to, all that stuff. However, I think a lot of us are realizing that there's actually like a very unique type of loneliness that's associated with this sort of tech and digital age. And so no notifs on my phone kind of feels like so much lonelier than if someone said like there's no knocks on my front door. And what I mean by that is because if you were to be saying, well, no one's knocking on my door, then you were to say, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, someone's knocking on your door. And if someone's knocking on your door, that means they've physically traveled all the way from their home or wherever they were at and gone to your place of residence. And they're there knocking on the door, ready to greet you, hug you, hang out with you, all that stuff. So there's a real physical connection and a sort of it's a larger gesture, especially again in this tech age. A friend texting you versus a friend coming to visit you is very different in terms of the effort and the meaningfulness of the gesture. So if you were to say, well, no one's knocking on my door, yeah, that's sad, but that's also such a I don't know, I don't want to say big ask, but you get what I mean. It's such a gesture that it's like, well, yeah, but technically everyone has time when there's no one knocking on their door. Not everyone has someone knocking on their door 24/7. But to not even have any notifications on your phone adds an extra level to that, because it's not just that someone isn't driving all the way over to see you. They're not even, willing to pick up the phone and just shoot you a text, see how you're doing. Basically, it's so easy now to check in on your friends and see how they're doing. And so if no one's even doing that for you, it's a very brutal, lonely feeling. Because you have that access, and then you open your phone that has no notice and you see pictures of your friends going out and doing stuff, and then you feel like you missed out on seeing them and all of that stuff. So it's sort of it's kind of like if you were to think if it's on your birthday and no one comes to see you on your birthday and brings you cake. That's sad, that could hurt your feelings. But if that doesn't happen and no one even texts you happy birthday, not even to mention gives you a phone call, but no one even just texts you, that's a very lonely feeling. And I think it's something that a lot of people are feeling right now. And that's why I feel songs like this are so important, because I think hearing another artist say, something like no notice on my phone, it lets you know that if you're going through a time in your life where you have no notifications on your phone and you're feeling really lonely, you at least know that you're not alone in being lonely, if that makes sense. It's like, and I think that's why art is so important, because it doesn't only teach you to empathize, but it shows that other people can empathize with you and your own feelings. And then we have this last line: sunken silence has engulfed the very life I lead. And I think this usage of the adjective sunken is so interesting, because you can read sunken as sort of two different ways. Some can have sort of a sunken face, which is sort of its own sort of description of sadness. You could describe someone who's sad as having a sunken face or a sunken look on their face. But also, if something sinks in water, for example, it means it's really heavy. It's, it can't float. It's not light, it's substantial. So the silence in this sense is so either just melancholy or so heavy that, it can sink itself because it's so heavy, and it's engulfed, which is sort of also a watery type adjective, because if you sink in water, you can become engulfed by water. So in this, Nerissa is engulfed by this sunken silence. And if you think of it as, there's the water and then the silence, it's this big heavy thing that's, sinking you, and then you're engulfed within that silence and that sort of heaviness. That's like an extra layer of being, dragged down to the depths. And it's engulfing the very life I lead. So this is, affecting every aspect of her life. This isn't just today, this is something that's been ongoing. And then we have the chorus, which goes: colored in shades of gray, watching the years pass in front of me, memories I wish would stay, always fade away. I'm lonely in this blue, blue world. So we already discussed these first two lines, so for now I'm going to sort of put them off to the side and focus on this part of memories I wish would stay, always fade away. I'm lonely in this blue, blue world. I think this is such like a tragic sentiment, because I think sometimes we want painful memories to fade away. So, for example, if you had a really, really bad fight with a friend and you stopped being friends, I think to a degree you would maybe want that memory of that fight to fade away. And I think in a way you would want the memory of that friend to fade away, because if you're not able to reconcile things, ultimately the memory of them is, more painful than, it's almost worth holding on to. That being said, sometimes things just sort of happen in life and you find yourself in a lonely state, and so you don't have like this big explosive trigger of, oh, this was, the bomb that set off me getting into a huge fight with my friend. Sometimes your friends just fade away, or they'll ghost you out of nowhere and you'll never understand why. Or again, like, the ghosting is painful, but sometimes you just, separate from your friends. Maybe they move away or something like that. Or you both start a different chapter in your lives. And in that way, sometimes those friends can still feel like warm faces that you don't want to let go of, because even though you may not understand why you went separate ways, if there isn't like bad blood, that could still be a sense of comfort knowing that you had this friend out there or something like that. But so here in this cruel blue, blue world, we see that even these memories that you wish would stay fade away. So again, that's an even further level of loneliness, because if you think of like the first tier is, lonely because you're not near people, then the second tier here is that, you're lonely from yourself because you sort of feel a disconnect from yourself. And then there's sort of this third one of like, even your memories are leaving you. So you have this extra loneliness of like, you don't even have the company of the past anymore. So you're stuck in this blue world that's keeping you very present in the blue world. Because I also feel like if you're in this blue world, if you're able to rely on memories of days when you weren't in the blue world, it's easier to remind yourself that it won't always be blue. If you're able to say like, well, things will get better because I remember just last year, I had friends and I was smiling and I never thought I would have bad days kind of thing. Similarly with this, if you are losing those memories, then you can't tell yourself that maybe tomorrow will be like the past. So you're just stuck. And this is often how feelings of loneliness and depression and sadness can feel. It feels all consuming, like we saw in the last verse, where you're sunken in it and it's engulfing you. You're not able to see the warmer past to believe in the warmer future. And so I think this is a very poetic and like heartbreaking description of this sort of state of mind. All right, so then we have our bridge, which goes, though my heart is torn and my weary wings are worn, just tonight can't I dream of a better life with happiness in sight. And when I read this bridge, I was immediately reminded of a song by the Smiths called Asleep. It's honestly one of the saddest songs I know. And it goes, here are two passages from it that go, sing me to sleep, sing me to sleep. I don't want to wake up on my own anymore. Sing me to sleep, sing me to sleep. I don't want to wake up on my own anymore. There is another world, there is a better world, there must be, well, there must be, well, there must be, well, there must be. And I feel like Nerissa is channeling a similar sentiment with just tonight can't I dream of a better life with happiness in sight. And this is like a very heavy passage, and I want to almost like take a moment to respect that, just because if you're saying that you want to dream of a better life with happiness in sight, there's an implication that you've sort of maybe given up on thinking that you'll ever find that in the real world. So it's sort of like, at least when I'm asleep can things be better, because especially this line of with happiness in sight, because that implies that she's not even asking for a dream where she is at the state of happiness. She's asking for a dream where things are better just because happiness is in sight. Which means again that this narrator is feeling like happiness is so far, and so not in sight, that the only way they would ever get happiness in sight is through a dream. And then furthermore, since they're like they're not even asking, they're saying, can't I? Which implies almost like a frustration of like they've tried to dream of a better life before and they've struggled and it hasn't happened, because you can't control your own dreams in that way. It's saying like almost from a frustration of just this once, just tonight, can't I dream of a better life with happiness in sight? And, we're left wondering if that dream really will happen, or if it'll be another night where, they wake up alone in the morning, just like in the Smith song, where it's the sing me to sleep. I don't want to wake up on my own. Sing to me, sing to me. There is another world. There's a better world. There must be. There's sort of this insistence that things can't truly be this bad everywhere. Even if it's in an alternate reality, a different world that you have to travel to, surely things can't be worse there because things are already so bad right now. And then just to discuss these first two lines, though my heart is torn and my weary wings are worn. I think what's hard about this is a heart being torn is sort of passive. And passive, I mean both kind of literally passive, but also grammatically. It's saying that, Nerissa, her heart didn't tear itself. It's torn potentially by someone else, and again, by someone else, it could also be a personification of something like loneliness. You could say that loneliness tore your heart apart, but this one has it that something else did it. But then my weary wings are worn. Something's usually worn from exhaustion. And so these wings of trying to fly away, she said over and over again that she's trying to fly away from this blue world in these choruses. And so here we're getting again that we're seeing that she's tried over and over and over again. And at this point she's exhausted. Her wings are worn from the end, so at this point she's almost giving up on flying away because her wings are so worn out. So rather than physically, literally flying and finding a better place, a non-blue world, she's just hoping that she's going to stay in the blue world, but at least can dream of a non-blue world. Even though she knows that means that she'll still wake up in the blue world, if that makes sense. And, just because this is a Poetics of, I do want to take a moment to just sort of acknowledge the actual language. We have these W sounds with weary, wings are worn, and, torn and worn are rhyming. So there's a poetry to all of this. Tonight and sight, those rhyme together. And so, she's able to still incorporate all these poetic techniques, but without making it sound too, let's say, cheesy, because it's kind of tough. When you're writing a poem, I feel like a lot of beginning poets myself included, want to use formal poetry because it's sort of easier having sort of some of those guidelines. So, you might try to write a sonnet, for example, but often then you find that using that rhyme scheme and that meter can sometimes give your writing a sort of sing-songiness that you didn't intend, or it might sound too archaic and, not as serious as you want it to be. And so rhyme in that way can sometimes be really hard to pull off because you don't want it to be, or a forced rhyme where it's like it might be a really sad line and then you add another line just to fulfill the rhyme or something like that. But here, using very, strong word choice and sort of a minimalistic rhyming is still able to convey all that heaviness and weight that this bridge sort of needs to convey, while still being able to use, proper poetic technique, which, is very admirable and very impressive. And here we have this final chorus, which goes, colored in shades of gray, watching my life pass in front of me. Maybe it's not too late. If I can't escape, I'll have to make my own way. Colored in shades of gray, palette in hand, I can make a change. I'll try to find the strength to take a breath and paint, bring color to this blue, blue world. And, right from, immediate reaction is that something I love about Nerissa's writing style, which we looked at in My Feelings, for example, is there's usually a clear change in the narrator by the end of the song/poem. But what's important to acknowledge is that change doesn't always have to be super drastic, where it's like, and now everything's okay. I start off sad and now I'm super happy. It can just be like a slight change in heart, a slight change in perspective, maybe a different strategy of how to go about things, that we still see some sort of growth and change. So here, we're not getting an end where it's like, oh, I realized actually I can change everything, and I did change everything, and I used, the color, and I brought color to the world, and now everything's better, and all that loneliness is gone. It doesn't end on that. It just ends with a change in perspective, that character growth of the character realizing that maybe it's not too late. Maybe they can make that change. And so they're holding the palette in their hand. They're affirming that they can make the change, but then there's the doubt. So it's, I can make a change, but I'll need to find the strength to do it. Take a breath and paint to bring color to this blue, blue world. This isn't in past tense. It hasn't been done yet, but there's hope that it can be done. And I think it's worth acknowledging that this also doesn't end with everything being totally resolved, because I still think there's something kind of despairing and sort of, sad about the fact that this narrator, this speaker, this protagonist, this subject has ultimately resolved to think that they can't escape. So there's this implication that they're not going to try to escape anymore. So, if you almost thought of them as being in this box of the blue world, and they kept thinking, if I can just fly, I can fly away, and then I can, leave the box of the blue world. But here in the ending, they've discovered, or at least they've made up their mind, that there's no way to escape this blue world. They're going to be in here forever, so the best they can do is make the most of the blue world by then adding color and painting, in the blue world to try to make this sort of hell a better place, which is actually very similar to some of the themes that we see in Paradise Lost. We've talked about this before with some of our other Poetic Genius stuff, but one of the more impressive sort of sentiments stated in it is that, the mind can make a hell of heaven or a heaven of hell, and it's all within the mind. And similarly here, if you can't escape, you have to make your own way. You can make a change, not wait for the change to happen, not wait for someone else to make the change. You can make the change. And yeah, it's going to require strength, but you're going to try to find it. Just take a breath and do it. Begin actively doing it. Paint here is an active present verb, and bring is also active present. It may not be passive, it may not be accomplished, but it's definitely active. It's currently happening. It's not like later I'll bring color, later I'll paint. It's take a breath and begin to paint, begin to bring color to this blue world. And again, it's, we can't deny that this part begins still with Nerissa feeling that she's colored in shades of gray and she's watching her life pass in front of her. This is still a repetition of that sort of blue world sentiment, but there's been change. It's not all, perfectly happy, but there is some hope in it. I think something that, I don't know, I don't want to say it's unintentional, because again, I don't know what the author's intent is, but I think something that's sort of sad is that, as we discussed earlier, it's the character of the poem, the subject, who we're calling Nerissa, who is colored in shades of gray, and in the end they decide to bring color to the blue world. But I'm sort of left wondering with my sort of poet's annotating pen, when are they also going to hopefully bring some color back to themselves? I think you can read this last line and sort of read the implication that in the process of bringing color to the blue world, they're going to bring color to themselves, or maybe once they're done painting the world, they'll be able to turn the paint to themselves, because we know they have the palette in hand, they have the paint. But there's a part of me that's just, since I'm cheering on this protagonist, that I would love to hear that they're going to bring color not only to the world but to themselves. But with that being said, I think that's sort of going to wrap up this, latest episode in the Poetic Genius of. It's always such a pleasure to take a look at Nerissa's work. I think she brings a very interesting sort of, artistic expression and perspective to this. Like I said, I think she is a fan of the Smiths. I think that was mentioned before. I just know the Smiths from my own listenings, and that's what made me draw that comparison. But at the same time, like I said, when we saw In My Feelings and stuff, there's definitely a sort of romanticism / dark romanticism sentiment in a lot of the writing. And again, I think it's very interesting that all of her pieces usually end with some sort of change in perspective, which creates sort of like a larger story and narrative throughout the piece, rather than it just being capturing one moment, one perspective, one state of mind. So something else, that we've talked about before with Nerissa's writing, but she does a really great job of always having her metaphors and, figurative language always sort of fit the actual theme and tone. the description of the wings being worn, that directly ties into the sentiment of trying to fly away. And also your wings being worn kind of has to do with almost like a sort of Paradise Lost thing, like I said, with the making a mind of hell. Can make hell out of heaven or heaven out of hell. If you have that sentiment, that's sort of a Lucifer sentiment, which goes back to the Romantics, because they saw John Milton's work as being, sort of pro-Satan, and that it wasn't pro-biblical Satan, but pro that sort of rebellious figure. Also, Nerissa is a demon, part demon, part raven, I believe. And so there's a lot going on here where I feel like there's some channeling of Paradise Lost and there's some channeling of the Romantics. And it just makes for a very powerful piece. I also want to applaud sort of the bravery of writing such an emotionally vulnerable piece, because it's really hard to put yourself out there and really express yourself in this way, and it takes real courage. So I really admire that. But with that being said, I'm gonna wrap this one up, so take care and I will see you in the next one.